Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Imagine a photograph discovered in a dust-filled attic trunk, its corners curled, its edges burned by the slow crawl of time. In the image stands a young girl, her eyes too large for her face, her features misshapen in ways that suggest more than poverty, more than hunger. She wears a plain dress, and beside her, looming in shadow, is a man twice her age, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that makes your chest tighten with unease. For decades, the photograph was passed quietly through local whispers until one chilling detail was confirmed. The man was her father, and the girl, she was not just his daughter, she was his wife. This story does not come from the fringes of folklore, nor from the invention of rumor. It comes from a real family in the forgotten corners of America, where isolation and secrecy allowed unspeakable acts to flourish behind closed doors. It is a story of a girl who never had the chance to be a child, who carried the scars of a bloodline bent inward on itself until love and kinship became indistinguishable from possession and control. What makes this story more haunting than most is how carefully it was hidden. The local church denied knowing, though records proved their silence. The neighbors turned their heads, muttering but never acting. And the authorities, when they finally became aware, treated the matter not with justice, but with shameful dismissal, as if exposing the truth would be more dangerous than letting it continue. This is not just a story about one girl forced into the most horrific kind of marriage imaginable. It is also a story about the weight of silence, about how communities choose denial over confrontation, and about the children who pay the ultimate price for the sins of the bloodlines before them. Tonight, we peel back the layers of her life, not to sensationalize, but to remember, to confront, and to understand the depth of what inbreeding, control, and secrecy can do when left unchecked. Because the face in that photograph is not only hers, it is a mirror reflecting what human beings are capable of ignoring when the truth becomes too monstrous to face. The girl's name is deliberately omitted from many accounts, perhaps as a final attempt to shield her from further shame, or perhaps because the family line itself has worked tirelessly to erase her. What we do know is that she was born into a household where bloodlines were already tangled. Her parents were not strangers joined in holy union, but cousins, the result of generations of isolation and the refusal to let the family name drift outside its narrow walls. From the moment of her birth, her features bore the subtle signs of this legacy. Eyes too close, jaw slightly underformed, speech that lagged behind other children. These things in themselves did not condemn her, but in a community that already knew her lineage, they whispered her fate before she could speak it herself. Her father, a man of stern presence and iron voice, was said to be both feared and respected in the small town. Outwardly, he was the provider, the hard-working patriarch who demanded silence at the dinner table and obedience at church. Inwardly, however, he was a man consumed by power, a man who saw the very flesh of his own children not as sacred, but as an extension of his dominion. To him, blood was not a boundary, it was property. When the girl reached adolescence, the whispers grew louder. Neighbors began to notice how often she disappeared from the schoolhouse, how she seemed withdrawn, her gaze fixed always at the floor. Teachers spoke of her bruises, subtle ones hidden beneath sleeves and collars, but their concerns were dismissed. The explanation was always the same. She was clumsy, she was delicate, she was different. And in a town that thrived on the quiet covering of sins, no one pressed further. It was in her 15th year that the truth became undeniable. Records indicate a ceremony, a marriage not in a church but in a living room where a Bible was placed on a table and her father recited vows not to God but to himself. She was dressed in white, he was dressed in black. The witnesses were not strangers, but family members bound by fear, silence, and the sickening belief that tradition outweighed morality. From that day forward, she was no longer known as his daughter, but as his bride. The horror of her story lies not just in the act itself, but in how normal it was made to appear, The wedding photograph was hung on the wall. Visitors were told to congratulate the union, and the girl, barely a woman, was swallowed whole by the silence of those who knew and chose to look away. From the outside, the house looked like any other. Paint peeling from the wooden boards, a porch sagging under years of neglect, a chimney that coughed smoke into the sky each winter. But inside, it was a prison. The girl's world became smaller with each passing year, her days dictated entirely by the man who was both father and husband. She was not permitted to step outside without his presence. She was not allowed to speak freely in public. Her identity, once fragile, was erased altogether. She became a shadow that moved only where he demanded, a possession with no voice of her own. Family members who visited would later whisper that she never smiled, that her eyes seemed fixed on something far away, as if she were already gone in spirit. They said she carried herself with the quiet resignation of someone who knew no escape would ever come, as though she had accepted her fate as part of some cruel inheritance. But this acceptance was not peace, it was survival. The marriage quickly became more than symbolic. Soon, the girl was carrying children. Local records confirm multiple births, though not all of them survived. The children who did were said to be frail, with features that echoed the unmistakable signs of a collapsing bloodline. Bowed legs, crossed eyes, fragile bones that broke too easily. Each child was a living reminder of the cycle being repeated, the echo of one man's grip tightening around his own lineage. And still, the community remained silent. Neighbors who knew the truth lowered their heads when passing the house. The pastor offered quiet prayers but no intervention. Even the authorities, when rumors reached their ears, dismissed them as family matters, too delicate to disturb. To expose the truth would mean exposing themselves, their complicity, their silence, their failure to protect the most vulnerable among them. For the girl, now a mother, the lines between victim and prisoner blurred beyond recognition. She was bound not only by blood, but by the very children she bore, each one tying her tighter to the man who had stolen her youth. Her voice, if it had ever been hers, was gone completely. And so she became an invisible figure within her own story, spoken of in whispers, remembered in fragments, but never fully seen. The question lingers even now. How many others like her existed, hidden behind doors that never opened, concealed beneath the polite smiles of small towns, unwilling to face their darkest truths? By the time she reached her 20s, the girl looked decades older. Hardship had carved her face into a map of suffering, each line a reminder of nights without rest, days without freedom, and years of carrying children who were never allowed to grow into their own lives. Those who encountered her, rarely, and only in fleeting moments, described her as frail, her skin pale and weathered, her hair prematurely streaked with grey. But what unsettled them most were her eyes. They were vacant, hollow, as if she were merely watching the world through a window she could never pass through. Stories tell of how she began to fade into the background of her own household. Visitors recalled her moving silently between rooms, avoiding direct conversation, her responses rehearsed, as though every word was monitored. It was said that her father-husband demanded she address him with titles of reverence, that she never call him father in public, but husband instead. And each time she complied, it was as though another piece of her fractured. The children, meanwhile, grew up in a world where confusion was their only inheritance. To them, the man they called father was also their grandfather. The woman they called mother was also their sister. And in that twisted web of relationships, identity itself lost all meaning. Teachers noted their strange mannerisms, their withdrawn nature, their difficulties with learning. But in a community that already suspected the truth, no one dared ask questions too directly. The less said, the safer one remained. There are fragments of testimony suggesting that the girl, at least once, tried to reach out for help. A letter was rumored to have surfaced, written in shaky handwriting pleading for escape. But by the time it was passed along, it was too late. The letter disappeared into the hands of a relative, destroyed before it could bring change. Whether she truly wrote it, or whether it was another whispered invention, we may never know. What we do know is that no help ever came, and so the cycle deepened. Each year blurred into the next, each child bound tighter to a family history they could neither understand nor escape. What began as a single act of domination had now become an entire world of suffering, sealed off from the outside by a wall of silence. It is here in this suffocating stillness that the most haunting question arises. At what point does a bloodline stop being a family and become instead a curse? As the years dragged on, the girl's story became less about one life stolen and more about the ripple effect it cast across generations. Her children, fragile and confused, carried the weight of their birth like a brand they could never shed. They were marked before they could speak, by their appearance, their behavior, and the whispered suspicions of the town that surrounded them. Wherever they went, silence followed. Teachers pitied them, neighbors pitied them. But pity was never protection. It was another form of distance, another way of saying, "You are not like us." And through it all, the man at the center of this tragedy lived without consequence. To him, the children were proof of his power, proof that his blood would continue, even if twisted beyond recognition. He paraded them as his legacy, even as their suffering betrayed the rot of his choices. His pride was their punishment. The girl, trapped in her role as both daughter and wife, had no allies. She bore the shame that should have belonged to him. The town whispered about her, not him. They asked why she didn't leave, why she didn't fight back, as though a girl raised in chains could suddenly break them without anyone's help. Their silence protected him, while their judgment condemned her. This is where the story becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror. Because every community, no matter how far removed from this tale, has chosen silence at some point. Every generation has hidden sins it refuses to confront. And when a child suffers for it, the question becomes not what happened to her, but what did we allow to happen by looking away? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out, even at the risk of being cast out yourself? Or would you have turned your head, convincing yourself it wasn't your burden to carry? Because that is what this town did. They chose comfort over truth. They chose silence over justice, and in doing so they allowed a girl's life to collapse into the role her father had written for her. The story endured, not because of one man's cruelty alone, but because an entire community allowed it to continue. In the end, the girl's life seemed to vanish into the same silence that had always surrounded her. There are no clear records of her death, no obituary with her name, no headstone carefully etched to mark her passing. Some say she died young, worn down by childbirth after childbirth, her body unable to endure the endless cycle. Others whisper that she lived into middle age, her face hard and unrecognizable, her soul long gone before her body followed. The truth is blurred, just as everything about her existence was blurred, between daughter and wife, victim and prisoner, woman and ghost. What we do know is this: her children carried her story forward, even if they never spoke it aloud. Their lives, too, became testaments to the destruction hidden within their family line. Some did not survive childhood, others lived on but were marked by deformities and frailties that made them constant reminders of their origin. And still, the silence held. The town rarely spoke of them except in hushed tones, with pity and disgust tangled together in equal measure. It was not until decades later that fragments of the truth began to surface. Through scattered documents, through rumors passed between generations, through a photograph found in a forgotten drawer. By then, most of those directly involved were long gone. What remained were shadows and questions, and perhaps that was always the intention: erase the names, burn the letters, let the house collapse back into the earth, then pretend none of it ever happened. But history does not disappear so easily. Even when the facts are buried, the atmosphere of them lingers, like the chill of a room where something unspeakable once occurred. You feel it without needing proof. You sense it in the way people lower their voices when the family name is mentioned. You see it in the way old houses are avoided, their windows boarded as if to keys. Keep something inside. The girl herself is gone, but her story remains. Not in the way she might have wanted, not as a tale of resilience or triumph, but as a warning etched into the soil of forgotten America. a warning of what happens when silence becomes more powerful than truth, when blood becomes both weapon and chain. And as we reach this point, we are forced to ask, was she truly erased, or is she still here, lingering in every whispered story that refuses to die? In the end, the story of the girl forced to marry her own father is not only a tragedy of one life, it is a tragedy of an entire community, of generations bound together by silence and denial. What began as a single act of domination grew into a lineage poisoned by secrecy, each child carrying the weight of decisions they never asked for, each generation living under the shadow of a sin no one dared to name. When we look back now, with the safety of distance, it is tempting to see her as an isolated case, a single haunting story buried in some forgotten county. But the truth is darker than that. Her story echoes the hidden chapters of American history, families who closed their doors, towns that chose to look away, churches that turned forgiveness into a shield for cruelty. She was not the only one. She was simply one of the few whose photograph, whose whispers, whose ghost survived long enough for us to uncover. What makes this story endure is not the shock of the act itself, but the reflection it casts on us, because silence did not die with her. It lives on in every community that buries its shame, in every family that hides abuse behind smiles and locked doors. The haunting truth is that the past is never really gone. It lingers, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to ask the questions that were never asked when it mattered most. And so the photograph remains, the girl in her plain dress, the man with his hand resting on her shoulder, the image of a life stolen before it even began. We may never know her full name or the sound of her voice, or the dreams she once carried before they were taken from her. But by remembering, by refusing to let silence erase her completely, we give her something she was denied in life: recognition. Her story is not comfortable. It is not easy. But perhaps that is why it must be told, because in telling it, we remind ourselves of what happens when people choose silence over courage, when they allow blood to become both weapon and curse. And so, as we close this story, I leave you with this. When you see injustice, when you sense a truth no one else wants to face, will you be silent like the town that buried her, or will you speak, even if your voice shakes? Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please like and subscribe so more hidden histories can be brought into the light, and share your thoughts in the comments, because the past is only forgotten when we refuse to remember it.